Hi everybody, this is Leo Volont. Welcome to my 4-part series, Creating a Better God. For this blog, let's talk about religion. Have you ever wondered whether perhaps the reason why there are so many atheists is because atheism seems so plausible? That is, because so many people see no clear signs of there being a God. But the real problem may be that they're looking for a God without knowing what to look for because there's some mistaken conception that's misleading them. Or maybe they're looking in the wrong place, or if it is the right place, well, maybe they wouldn't know a God if they saw one. But to be fair to everybody, they've been told where to look, and they've been told what to expect. So the problem isn't with them, but with the info they've been working with, that the religious traditions that have come down to us are somehow screwed up. So let's start by taking a look at those traditions. The West even now is still under the influence of classical Greek philosophy, where God is envisioned as a collection of all positive absolutes, all powerful, all loving, all knowing, and all decisive. This seems okay at first glance, but becomes problematic in its implications. For instance, we can infer from the omnipotent will criteria that all events have meaning and purpose, and therefore that all is as it should be, at least from the divine perspective, because his will should never be wrong, right? But yeah, because of the best of all possible worlds thinking, rich people can justify and entrench their privileges as divinely bestowed, while also concluding that God has reasons of his own for hating the poor and deliberately subjecting them to misery. The poor themselves, not wishing to suppose that God is their avowed enemy, well, they instead suppose God is either testing them with moral challenges or building their character by providing them with a kind of resistance training. But even the most miserable and devout among us will conclude that their God has been relentlessly against them. And that certainly can't make any sense to them given their optimism and charitable religious beliefs. A general crisis of faith must emerge, shouldn't it? We saw such a crisis emerge as the 100 Years' War coincided with the Black Death, and then Europe has remained cynical and the French rude ever since. So yes, most people would now be skeptical of an all-powerful best of worlds God. But we should ask ourselves how the best of all possible world argument ever got so much traction to start with. It persisted up until modern times, didn't it? Well, aren't our objections largely based on moral grounds where we would suppose God would have too much decency to impose a divine order that had such a high proportion of might makes right in it? Then the flip side of that same argument in regards to the weak is, well, that to make the strongest chain, it is necessary only to eliminate the weakest links, and that the weak and the poor don't require all the superfluous effort required to bring them up to parity, so much as they only need to be excluded in order to make for a better world. I don't believe it personally, but it is nonetheless true that the herd only needs to be cold of its old, its lame, and its stragglers to be made perfectly healthy, right? We were presupposing a God of goodness and mercy, but where's the logical imperative for that assumption? God, as the ancient world envisioned, might have originally been a very pragmatic and unsentimental God, and that the theological stipulation for an infinitely loving God may have just been a recent times interpolation, trying to jam a modern square peg into a classically round hole, and we find that it just doesn't fit. Also, we need to recognize that the West largely held on to ancient barbarian pre-moral assumptions. If you can remember, the Greeks defeated the Persians, and that victory has cost us all dearly because the Persians were actually the more civilized and moral of the two powers. So in the West, the idea of might makes right, an intrinsic part of the barbarian ethos, well, it's been baked into our cake. So those grounded in Western thought and traditions would interpret the best of all worlds doctrine in terms of may the better man win, wouldn't they? The best of all possible worlds would be the strongest, not the nicest. Then we have the old scriptural aphorism, the beginning of wisdom is the fear of God, which to us sounds counterintuitive, doesn't it? We would have said love, wouldn't we? But fear rings truer to the barbarian Western ear, where God is not so much good as he is awesome. So yes, the West with its inherent barbarism has us stymied as far as religion is concerned. We can't show that their God isn't the real deal. We can only insist that we wouldn't like that God very much. But then we might suspect that a breakdown in the general consensus can't be an especially good thing for the case of there being a God. And all of God's absolutes by definition, well, shouldn't there ought to be an infinitely popular or absolutely likable, or at least a totally believable? Yeah, the lack of a consensus is a real problem for the Western God. Well, that's it for part 1. In part 2, we will look at the problems involved with the transcendental God of mystical experiences. If you want to do some homework, read up on it with William James' 1905 classic, Varieties of Religious Experience. The first and last time that science has looked at religion and spirituality. It's free online. See you all later.